The smell of charred meat wafted through the backyard, mingling with the crisp bite of fall air. My fingers tapped against the grill handle as I flipped the burgers, half listening to the laughter drifting from the patio. Kate, my wife, was entertaining our neighbors like she always did, her voice bright and easy, carrying over the buzz of conversation. She was in her element, graceful, charming, the center of attention. "Steve, you're burning the burgers," someone shouted, and I jolted out of my thoughts. I glanced down. Sure enough, blackened edges curled off one side of a patty. Better than undercooked. I yelled back, waving the spatula in mock defense. The truth was, I'd been distracted. Not by the task at hand or even the party, but by Kate. There was something about the way she tilted her head toward Dan, the neighbor from 2 houses down. Something too familiar. The way she leaned just a fraction closer than necessary, her laugh coming a little too quickly at his jokes. My grip on the spatula tightened as I watched, feeling the edges of a simmering unease I couldn't quite name. "Hey, Steve, save me one of those," Dan called out, breaking away from Kate and striding toward me. "Sure thing," I said, plastering on a smile that felt more forced than usual. As he grabbed a beer from the cooler by my feet, I couldn't help but notice the smug little grin tugging at his mouth. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of half-empty plates and wine-fueled chatter. Kate flitted from guest to guest, her laugh ringing out like a bell, her eyes flicking to me less often than usual. I told myself I was imagining things. A long week at work. A little too much bourbon in my glass. Nothing more. But then came the moment that changed everything. It was near midnight when I started cleaning up. Most of the guests had left, their goodbyes blending into one another until the house was finally quiet. I just stepped outside to collect the last few glasses from the patio when I heard a voice, a low murmur, carried by the wind. "I can't tonight. He's still awake." I froze. The voice was Kate's. It was coming from the far side of the yard, near the fence line. "No, don't text me. I'll call you tomorrow," she whispered. My breath caught in my throat as I crept closer, the patio lights dim enough to cloak my approach. Through the shadows, I saw her, phone pressed to her ear, her back to me. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't flirting. She was serious, almost pleading. The call ended abruptly, and she spun around, nearly dropping the phone when she saw me standing there. Her face blanched, the blood draining so quickly I thought she might faint. "Who were you talking to?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. She hesitated, just for a second. Then she smiled tight, forced. "Work stuff." One of the clients had a question. "At midnight? On a Saturday?" Her mouth opened to respond, but no words came. She didn't have an answer, and for the first time in our marriage, her silence didn't feel like an end to an argument, it felt like the start of something far worse. I didn't press her that night. I let her retreat inside, let her brush me off with a peck on the cheek and a muttered excuse about being tired. But as I stood on that patio, staring into the darkness where she'd been, I knew something was wrong. Something bigger than late-night phone calls. Something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The life I thought we'd built together, it had cracks. And I was about to find out just how deep they ran. The days following the late-night phone call were tense, not in a dramatic or obvious way, but in a way that gnawed at me. Kate moved through our routines like nothing had happened. She kissed the kids goodbye before school, called out reminders for me to grab milk or pick up dry cleaning, and answered my questions with the same warm tone she always had. But something had shifted, and I couldn't unsee it now that I was paying attention. It was little things at first, how she'd always kept her phone on the kitchen counter or the nightstand but now took it with her everywhere. Or how she seemed to be quicker to smile, laugh, and smooth over any tension, like she was trying too hard. Then there were the sudden errands, the quick dashes to the store for things we didn't really need, or her newfound love for jogging alone, something she hadn't done since college. I decided not to confront her right away. Instead, I watched, waited, and, admittedly, snooped a little. One morning, after she left for work, I decided to check her car. I told myself it was harmless, that I wasn't doing anything wrong. But as I rifled through the glove compartment, the center console, even the pockets behind the seats, I felt the weight of what I was doing. Nothing. It wasn't until I checked the trunk that I found something, a receipt, tucked into the corner near the spare tire. It was from a wine bar downtown, dated 2 nights before the party, at a time when she told me she was working late. My hands clenched the paper tighter than necessary as I stared at it. It wasn't the receipt itself that got to me, it was the fact that she hadn't mentioned it. Kate wasn't the type to hide things, not the Kate I thought I knew. That night, I asked her how her day at work had been, gauging her reaction, looking for a crack in the calm facade she wore so well. She smiled, leaned against the counter as she sipped her tea, and told me about a client meeting that had dragged on too long. She was good, too good. I nodded, acted disinterested, and let it go. But I couldn't let it go, not really. The next day, I decided to dig deeper. I remembered something from the party, Dan, our neighbor, and the way he'd seemed unusually comfortable with Kate. While she was at work, I took the plunge and checked our home Wi-Fi logs. I'm not a tech guy, not really, but it wasn't hard to figure out how to see devices that had connected to our network recently. Sure enough, Dan's phone had connected a couple of times in the past month. It could have been innocent, he might have visited for a drink or borrowed something, but my gut told me otherwise. I couldn't stop myself. That evening, when I saw him out in his yard, I walked over. Casual, friendly. I didn't want to tip him off. "Hey, Dan," I called out, leaning on the fence that separated our properties. He turned, his face lighting up with that same smug grin he always wore. "Steve. What's up?" "Oh, not much. Just wanted to ask, did you leave something at our place recently? I noticed your phone connected to our Wi-Fi a few times. Thought maybe you'd forgotten something." Dan blinked, the grin faltering for just a moment. "Oh, yeah, might have been when I stopped by to grab that ladder. Remember? I needed it for the gutters." I nodded slowly. "Right. The ladder." I didn't press further, didn't let him see that my stomach was in knots, that my mind was already racing. The turning point came a week later. Kate had gone for one of her evening jogs, and I decided to follow her. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but at this point, I needed answers. She set off down our street in her running gear, earbuds in, her pace steady. I waited until she was a block ahead before slipping out the door, keeping my distance. She ran a familiar route at first, past the park, around the community center, the same loop she'd always taken. I was starting to think I'd overreacted when she suddenly veered off, heading toward a quieter street, one lined with office buildings and small cafes. My pulse quickened as she slowed, glancing over her shoulder before ducking into an alley. I stopped at the corner, peeking around just in time to see her disappear into a side entrance of one of the buildings. It wasn't an office or a cafe. It was the wine bar. I waited, crouched behind a parked car, my heart pounding. 10 minutes later, the door opened, and Kate stepped out, not alone. Dan followed, his hand brushing against her lower back as they laughed softly. She turned to him, said something I couldn't hear, and he leaned in, his lips grazing her cheek before they parted ways. I didn't confront her then. I didn't yell or scream or demand answers. I walked home, numb, my mind blank. When she returned an hour later, flushed and smiling, I acted normal. I didn't mention the wine bar, didn't mention Dan. But something inside me had broken. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over in my head. The way she'd smiled at him. The way she'd let him touch her. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake. It was exactly what it looked like, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. By the time morning came, I had a plan. If she thought she could carry on like this, if she thought I'd just let it happen, she had another thing coming. I didn't sleep much the night after following Kate to the wine bar. My thoughts raced, blending anger, confusion, and hurt into a cocktail of emotions that left me restless. I wanted answers, but more than that, I wanted her to see the destruction she'd caused. By morning, I had decided I wasn't going to let this slide. She owed me the truth, no matter how ugly it was. The confrontation wasn't going to be some spontaneous explosion of rage, I'd make sure of that. I needed control. I needed to pin her down with facts, leaving no room for excuses or half-truths. Before she woke up, I grabbed my phone and drafted a short email to a private investigator I found online the previous night. A simple, no-frills message explaining I suspected my wife was having an affair and needed proof. It felt surreal, writing it out like that. Affair was such a clinical, cold word, but it was the only one that fit. I hit send and watched the message vanish from my outbox, a sense of grim resolve settling over me. By the time Kate came downstairs, I was already sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. "Morning," she said, her voice cheerful, as if nothing had changed. She poured herself a glass of orange juice and leaned against the counter, sipping it casually. "Big plans today?" I shook my head. "Not really. Just work." She nodded, oblivious to the storm brewing in my chest. "Cool. I might run some errands later. We're out of paper towels." The ease with which she spoke, the way she pretended everything was fine, it infuriated me. I forced myself to stay calm, to wait for the right moment. Confronting her without evidence would be a waste of time. The private investigator, Jim, called me back that afternoon. His voice was gruff, no nonsense, exactly what I needed. I explained the situation to him, laying out everything I'd observed over the past few weeks. He didn't offer much sympathy, he probably dealt with guys like me every day, but he assured me he'd get to the bottom of it. "Give me a week," he said. "I'll have something for you." A week felt like a lifetime, but I agreed. In the meantime, I kept up appearances, acting as normal as I could manage. It was harder than I expected. Every time Kate smiled at me or brushed her hand against mine, I wanted to ask her how she could look me in the eye and lie so easily. But I stayed quiet, swallowing my frustration and biding my time. Jim called me exactly 6 days later. His voice was clipped, businesslike. "You're going to want to see this," he said. We met at a diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where nobody would think twice about two men huddled over a folder of photos. Jim slid it across the table without a word. I opened it and felt my stomach drop. There she was, Kate, smiling and laughing as she leaned into Dan, their heads close together. In one photo, his hand rested on her thigh. In another, they were holding hands as they walked down the street. But it was the last photo that broke me. They were in a car, his car, parked on a quiet street. Her hand was on his cheek, pulling him in for a kiss. It wasn't a peck, wasn't something innocent or friendly. It was intimate, deliberate. The kind of kiss she used to give me. I closed the folder, my hands shaking. "Thanks," I muttered, shoving a wad of cash into Jim's hand before walking out. That evening, I waited until the kids were asleep before confronting her. I didn't want them to hear what was about to happen. Kate was in the living room, scrolling through her phone, when I walked in. I stood there for a moment, staring at her, trying to reconcile the woman I loved with the one in those photos. "Steve," she said, looking up at me. "What's wrong?" I pulled the folder out from behind my back and dropped it on the coffee table. "Why don't you tell me?" Her face paled as she opened the folder, her hands trembling. She flipped through the photos, her expression shifting from shock to panic to guilt. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were wide, glistening. "I can explain." "Don't," I snapped. "Don't insult me by pretending there's an explanation that makes this okay." She started to cry, her voice trembling. "It's not what it looks like." "I mean, it is, but..." "You're damn right it is," I interrupted, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "How long, Kate? How long have you been screwing him behind my back?" She flinched, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't like that. I never meant for it to happen. It just did." "Don't give me that bullshit," I said, my voice cold. "You don't accidentally end up in another man's car, kissing him like you're in love." She covered her face with her hands, sobbing. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I didn't want to hurt you." "Save it," I snapped. "The only reason you're sorry is because you got caught." She didn't deny it. For a moment, the room was silent except for her muffled sobs. Then she looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "Steve, I love you. I do. I got lost. Things have been hard lately, and I." "Stop," I said, cutting her off. "You don't get to blame this on hard times. You made a choice, Kate. You chose him." Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time, she didn't try to argue. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Don't say anything," I said, my voice firm. "Pack a bag. Tonight. You're not staying here." Her eyes widened in shock. "Steve, please. Let's talk about this. We can fix it." "Fix it?" I laughed bitterly. "You can't fix this, Kate. You shattered it." She didn't move at first, as if she thought I might change my mind. When she realized I wasn't going to, she nodded slowly, her face crumpling as fresh tears fell. She got up and walked toward the stairs, her steps unsteady. As I watched her go, a strange sense of calm washed over me. It wasn't satisfaction or relief, just an odd, quiet clarity. The life I'd known was over, but at least now I knew the truth. The house was silent after Kate left that night. The kids were still asleep, completely unaware of the shift in their world. I sat in the living room, staring at the empty space where she had been just minutes before, my mind reeling with a mixture of rage and cold resolve. Her tear-streaked face kept flashing in my mind, but I pushed it aside. She had made her choices, and now it was my turn to make mine. I wasn't about to be the man who got walked over. If Kate thought she could dismantle our life and walk away with her dignity intact, she didn't know me at all. The first step in my plan was practical, securing my position. Early the next morning, I called my lawyer, Janet, someone I'd worked with before on a business dispute. She was sharp, ruthless, and exactly what I needed. I laid out everything for her, sparing no detail about Kate's affair and showing her the folder of evidence from the private investigator. Janet flipped through the photos with the same clinical detachment a surgeon might have for an operation. "This will help," she said, nodding as she closed the folder. "Infidelity doesn't always sway things in court, but this is strong leverage, especially if you're aiming for custody of the kids." Custody wasn't negotiable. Kate's betrayal extended beyond me. She'd put our entire family in jeopardy with her selfishness, and I wasn't about to let her take the kids with her while she played house with Dan. "Go for the jugular," I told Janet. "I don't want her walking away with more than she deserves. Make it clear she chose this." Janet smirked. "Oh, I can do that." Next, I turned my attention to Dan. He wasn't going to get off easy either. He thought he could come into my house, kiss my wife, and go back to his life like nothing happened? Not on my watch. The opportunity came quicker than I expected. Dan worked as a mid-level manager at a local logistics company, a job he liked to brag about at every neighborhood barbecue. It didn't take much digging to find out his company's HR policies, particularly their strict rules about relationships between employees and clients. With a little help from a friend in IT, I got my hands on an email exchange between Dan and Kate, a damning trail that confirmed they'd been meeting under the guise of client follow-ups. I forwarded the emails to Dan's HR department with a short note: "You might want to look into this." No signature, no traceable details. By the end of the week, Dan's car wasn't parked in his driveway during the day anymore, and I knew I'd hit my mark. That wasn't enough for me, though. Dan wasn't just some guy who made a mistake, he was a neighbor, someone who looked me in the eye while betraying me. So, I went further. I compiled the evidence into a neat little package, the photos, the emails, everything. Then I anonymously sent it to his wife, Beth. Beth and I weren't close, but I knew enough about her to know she didn't tolerate nonsense. She called me the same evening she received the package, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and humiliation. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she demanded. "I didn't want to act without proof," I replied. "But now you know." Her silence spoke volumes. I didn't need to say more. I'd handed her the same weapon I had used against Kate, and I trusted she'd wield it with just as much precision. With Dan's world crumbling, it was time to turn my attention back to Kate. While Janet worked on the legal side of things, I focused on dismantling the carefully curated image Kate had built for herself. She had always been the quintessential PTA mom, the friendly neighbor, the woman everyone admired. That was about to change. The neighborhood group chat was the perfect place to start. I didn't come right out and accuse her of infidelity, that would have been too obvious. Instead, I planted seeds. I casually mentioned how I'd been seeing a lawyer lately, how things at home were complicated. People asked questions, naturally, and I answered just enough to let their imaginations fill in the gaps. It didn't take long for whispers to spread. By the following week, Kate's once frequent invitations to coffee and brunches had dried up. I knew she felt the shift. Her texts to me became increasingly frantic, alternating between apologies and pleas to keep things between us. I ignored them. The final piece of my revenge was more personal, aimed at the one thing Kate valued most, her reputation. She had recently started a side business as a lifestyle coach, something she'd been pouring her energy into for months. Her social media was filled with posts about empowerment and living your truth, complete with carefully filtered photos of her at yoga retreats and networking events. It was almost laughable, given the reality of her double life. I created a burner account and started leaving comments on her posts, nothing outright hostile, just enough to raise eyebrows. Is this the same truth you were living at the wine bar last week? Funny how empowerment looks different behind closed doors. Her followers, mostly local moms and acquaintances, began questioning her, too. The comments section turned into a battlefield of passive-aggressive remarks and awkward deflections. Within days, Kate deactivated her account. By the time the divorce proceedings began, Kate was a shadow of the confident woman she'd been. Her lover was unemployed, her social standing in tatters, and her attempts to rebuild bridges with the kids had largely failed. I felt no guilt about what I'd done. She had chosen this path, and I had simply ensured she felt every consequence of her decision. But as I sat in Janet's office, signing the final papers that would officially end our marriage, I couldn't help but feel a strange emptiness. Revenge had been satisfying, sure, but it hadn't erased the pain. It hadn't rebuilt the life she'd destroyed. All it had done was level the playing field. As I walked out of the office, the weight of what came next settled on my shoulders. The fight was over, but the aftermath was just beginning. The divorce papers had been signed, and the dust of my revenge campaign was settling. Kate's affair, her lies, and her betrayal had consumed my life for months. But now, with the formalities behind us, there was one thing left to do: talk to her. Not the screaming matches we'd had, not the bitter exchanges through our lawyers, but a real conversation, one that would close the book on us. Kate had moved out weeks earlier, renting a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. The kids, Emma and Liam, spent most of their time with me, though they visited her on weekends. They weren't blind to what had happened, no matter how much we tried to shield them. Emma, my oldest, refused to say much about her mother, but her cold demeanor spoke volumes. Liam, younger and more forgiving, still asked me if I thought things could go back to the way they were. They couldn't. I didn't tell them I was going to see her. I just left the house that evening, telling Emma I'd be back in a couple of hours. She didn't ask where I was going, just nodded and returned to scrolling on her phone. The drive to Kate's apartment was short, but my thoughts dragged the minutes out. I didn't plan what I was going to say. I figured that after everything, the words would come naturally. I parked outside her building and sat in the car for a few minutes, staring at the dimly lit window that I guessed was hers. Finally, I went up and knocked. Kate opened the door, her face a mix of surprise and unease. She looked different, tired, older. The confidence she used to carry, the one that had once drawn me to her, was gone. "Steve," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "I wasn't expecting you." "I figured," I replied, stepping into the small living room. It was tidy, sparsely decorated, nothing like the home we'd shared. "I thought we should talk." She nodded, gesturing for me to sit. "Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "No, thanks." I sat on the couch, and she perched on the armchair across from me, her hands fidgeting in her lap. The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, I broke it. I need to understand. Why, Kate? Why him? Why any of this? She flinched, as if the question had physically hurt her. Steve, I've told you, I don't have a good answer. I don't think there is one. Try, I said, my voice steady but firm. Because I've been replaying this in my head for months, trying to figure out what I missed. What I did wrong. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't look away. It wasn't you, she said quietly. It wasn't about you. I mean, yes, we had our problems, everyone does, but you were a good husband, Steve. A great father. This wasn't your fault. Then whose fault was it, Kate? I asked, my frustration bubbling to the surface. Dan's? Did he trick you into it? Or was this just about you? She hesitated, wiping at her eyes. It was me. It was all me. I got bored, okay? I got caught up in feeling. I don't know, wanted? Excited? Dan made me feel young again, like I wasn't just a mom or a wife or. Spare me the midlife crisis speech, I snapped. You could have told me. We could have worked on things. Instead, you went behind my back and blew up our family. I know, she whispered, her voice cracking. I know, Steve. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I can't undo it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I stared at the floor, struggling to process her words. Part of me wanted to yell, to throw her excuses back in her face, but I was too tired for that. Instead, I leaned back and let out a long breath. I've spent months hating you, I admitted. Hating Dan. Hating myself for not seeing it sooner. I wanted you to feel as much pain as I did, and I think I succeeded. She looked up at me, her expression unreadable. You did, she said softly. Believe me, Steve, you did. I don't regret it, I said, meeting her gaze. But I don't feel better either. And that's what I came here to say. We're done, Kate. Really done. I don't think I'll ever forgive you, but I'm done letting this control me. I need to move on, for me, for the kids. Her tears fell freely now, but she didn't try to stop them. I never wanted to hurt you, she said. I know that sounds hollow now, but it's true. I loved you, Steve. I still do. Maybe you did, I replied. But not enough. And I can't live on maybes anymore. I stood, ready to leave. Kate rose too, her hands clenched at her sides. What happens now? She asked. You focus on being a good mom, I said. That's what happens. You've got a long way to go to rebuild what you broke with Emma and Liam. And I'll do whatever I can to make sure they're okay. But you and me? We're over. She nodded slowly, her face a mask of pain and acceptance. I'm sorry, Steve. For everything. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. I turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind me. The drive home was quiet, the streets empty. For the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of relief, not happiness, not closure, but a kind of clarity. The life I'd built with Kate was gone, but the pieces were still there. Emma, Liam, the future I still had. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was mine to rebuild. And rebuild it, I would. When I got back home that night, the house was quiet. Emma was in her room, and the only sound came from Liam's gaming console. The calm was a stark contrast to how life had felt just weeks earlier, when everything was chaos, anger, heartbreak, shouting matches. It was strange to think how much had changed, and how much still had to be sorted. I hung my keys on the hook by the door and walked into the kitchen. The light over the stove was still on, casting a soft glow on the counter where Emma had left a half-eaten bag of chips. I put it away, a small gesture to feel like I was maintaining order. It struck me how different everything felt without Kate here. The absence wasn't just physical, it was in the air, in the routines that had shifted. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, thinking about what Kate had said. About how it wasn't about me. It was hard not to take that personally. When someone shatters your life, it feels personal. But I realized, standing there in the quiet of my kitchen, that maybe she was right. It wasn't about me. That didn't make it better. It just made it different. The following weeks were a blur of adjusting to the new normal. The kids were my priority, and they weren't making it easy. Emma was angry at Kate, at me, at the world, and she had no problem showing it. She refused to visit her mother, barely spoke to me unless she had to, and spent most of her time locked in her room. Liam, on the other hand, acted like nothing had happened. He still played his video games, still made silly jokes at dinner. But I could see it in his eyes, the way he hesitated before asking certain questions. "Is Mom coming back?" he asked one night while we ate pizza in front of the TV. "No," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "But you'll still see her. She loves you, Liam. That hasn't changed." He nodded, but the answer didn't satisfy him. I knew it wouldn't. How could it? I spent hours trying to figure out how to navigate this mess for their sake. Parenting was hard enough when you had a partner to share the load. Now, it was just me. I went to bed exhausted every night, only to wake up and do it all over again. About a month after our divorce was finalized, I got a call from Janet, my lawyer. "Steve, just wanted to let you know the house is officially yours," she said. It felt surreal, hearing it put so simply. The house where Kate and I had built our life together was now mine alone. I didn't know if I wanted it to be. Part of me had thought about selling it, starting fresh somewhere else. But then I looked at Emma and Liam, at the lives they still had here, their school, their friends, the memories that weren't tainted by what had happened, and I decided to stay. That weekend, I went through the house, room by room, removing the things that no longer fit. Kate's books, her framed certificates, the little decorations she'd picked up over the years, they all went into boxes. I thought it would be cathartic, like clearing out the clutter would clear out the pain. It didn't. It just made the house feel emptier. One night, as I was finishing some work at the kitchen table, Emma came downstairs. She didn't say anything at first, just hovered in the doorway. "Everything okay?" I asked, glancing up. She shrugged, then walked over and sat across from me. "Do you think she even cares?" she asked, her voice sharp. It took me a moment to realize she was talking about Kate. "Of course she cares," I said carefully. "She loves you, Emma. That hasn't changed." "She doesn't act like it," Emma muttered, crossing her arms. "She ruined everything, and now she gets to just walk away." I sighed, setting my pen down. "She didn't walk away, Emma. She made a mistake, a big one. And she's going to have to live with that. But that doesn't mean she doesn't care about you." Emma scoffed, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to believe me, but she couldn't. "Not yet." "What about you?" she asked. "Do you still care about her?" The question caught me off guard. I thought about it for a long moment before answering. "I don't hate her," I said finally. "But I don't think I'll ever forgive her either. She broke something that can't be fixed." Emma nodded, her expression unreadable. She stayed for a while longer, not saying much, before heading back upstairs. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. As time passed, life started to settle into a rhythm. The wounds didn't heal overnight, but they began to scab over. I threw myself into work, into parenting, into rebuilding a life that looked nothing like the one I'd planned but was mine nonetheless. Kate and I kept our interactions brief, strictly about the kids. She tried to reach out a few times, sending emails or texts that ranged from apologies to updates about her job or her therapy sessions. I didn't reply. I couldn't. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I needed space. She was part of my past now, and that's where I intended to leave her. Emma slowly started to come around, though her relationship with Kate remained strained. Liam, ever the optimist, seemed to accept the new reality more easily. I envied him for that. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat in the living room with a glass of whiskey, thinking about everything that had happened. The pain, the anger, the revenge, all of it had been necessary in its own way. But now, sitting there in the quiet of my house, I realized it was time to let it go. The past was done. It had shaped me, scarred me, but it didn't define me. What mattered now was the future, the life I was building for myself and my kids. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And that was enough.